Hello all. As you can see from my title here today, I'm going to be speaking to you about stylometry, which is a field in DH largely concerned with the use of computer-assisted methods for analysing stylistic similarities in text. I appreciate that one or two of you might have taken my text analysis elective in second year, in which case you'll already be familiar with some of the things I'm going to talk about today. But that's fine, and hopefully you might be willing to bring some of your own experiences, because I know that some of you did stylometric studies for your assessments, to the discussion afterwards. I've called this paper Stylometry in Practice because I'm going to focus largely on what can be achieved with stylometry as opposed to focusing on any one specific stylometric method. So typically all the methods of doing stylometry are kind of the same. There is some slight mathematical nuance between different approaches, but I'm really not going to get bogged down in too much of that side of things today because frankly we don't have nearly enough time to get into it. And I think it's sometimes important for analytical DH to emphasize results more than it does method. I mean what I mean by that is say for example a couple of weeks ago what I really liked about Maureen's paper was that she showed us the results and interpretations that emerged from her study rather than getting too hung up on the specifics of method. And I really do think that's important because it demonstrates the so what of all this stuff. It shows to us why we should do distant reading by showing us things that were previously unknown as opposed to focusing on the technical aspects of it. She showed us the kind of critical payoff. But I mean, saying that, I do appreciate that stylometry will be new to some of you, so I will explain to some degree how it's done. But generally I want to look at some of the things you can do with stylometry, some of the things you can't, and some of my experience with the method in applied studies that I've published. So the first thing worth clarifying is what I mean when I say text. So stylometry is most widely used in the study of literature, I would argue, but as you know, we encounter text in a very wide range of places. So, apologies, let me very briefly mute my phone. Text is everywhere. So I mean, if you think of some of the places you encounter text in our daily work as scholars and scholars of DH and the Arts and Humanities, we have historical documents, political speeches, literature, but you also encounter text in your everyday personal lives, social media posts, shopping lists, basically any form of written record can be seen as text. And stylometry can be used on any of these provided you have enough text for your test to be considered statistically valid. So all of my examples here are going to be based on literature because that's where my work resides. But as I go through this presentation, I would invite you all to think about the kinds of text that you encounter in your disciplines and whether or not there would be some value in applying stylometry to those texts. And with that in mind, we can ask, what is stylometry? And this definition here that you can see in the screen is from Hugh Craig, and I think it's as good as I think it's as good a starting point as any. Computational stylistics, or what is often now called stylometry, aims to find patterns in language that are linked to the processes of writing and reading, and thus to style in the wider sense, but are not demonstratable without computational methods. So one thing that might not be clear here is what we mean by style. So Craig describes it as the processes of reading and writing, but I mean, what does he mean by that? So style basically refers to how something is written. So style has nothing to do, and this is important for later, with the content of a text. Style has nothing to do with what a piece of writing is about. A good way to think about style is to compare, the manual for your toaster with a poem by Seamus Heaney. So, I mean, they're both text, both are pieces of writing, but the manual for your toaster is intended purely to communicate information. The people who made your toaster want you to know how it works, and so they've produced a document that is very clearly written with simple communicative language that anyone can understand. Seamus Heaney's poem, on the other hand, is inherently expressive. He uses language as an aesthetic thing, creative sounds and patterns, that are artistic and have meaning, but that meaning isn't always clear. He makes you work for it, yeah? And when you read your toaster's manual, you're probably going to understand the language immediately, whereas a Heaney poem, can often require multiple readings, because the way it's written is complicated. I mean, Heaney could write a poem about a toaster, and it would not be as easy to read as the manual, or indeed you could even have had Heaney write the manual itself. But the last person you probably want to write your toaster manual is Seamus Heaney. I'm possibly labouring the point a bit now, but that's all style is. It's the way something is written. It doesn't, anytime you have read something and said, I really don't get this, or I don't like how it was written, you were commenting on the style of the text. And that is what Craig means by the processes of writing. He means the ways in which words are selected to form sentences to convey a message. I mean, that act of selection will differ greatly depending on the author of a piece. When I choose words to express something, and any of you choose words to express something, we choose different words. We will always choose different words, because my style will be different to yours. Now, I do hope that I haven't lingered too much there on a boring analogy, but I think it is really important, because it's a very common mistake that you do not confuse the content of a piece of writing for its style. Style has nothing to do with subject matter, so that's important to remember. So Francois Laramie's explanation of style is very useful. He says that each person has their own unique vocabulary. Some people write in short sentences, while others prefer long blocks of text consisting of many clauses. No two people use semicolons, em-dashes, and other forms of punctuation in the exact same way. And that's basically what stylometry does. It seeks to use computers to identify each person's unique way of writing, and use that information to detect broader trends and patterns in how a corpus has been constructed, or in other words, how a set of texts have been written and how they might relate to each other. So what can we do with this? Well, if you know how a group of authors write, and you know how a group of texts have been written, the most obvious thing you can do is authorship attribution. So you can use stylometry in the first instance to identify the authors of anonymous texts. So there's been, I think, some high-profile examples of this kind of thing. One example would be work by Patrick Uwola, who helped to prove that Harry Potter author J.K. Rowling was in fact the real writer of The Cuckoo's Calling, published under the pen name Robert Galbraith. Another high-profile example came in 2015 when Ghost at a Watchman was published. So many of you have probably read and or certainly heard of To Kill a Mockingbird, which was published in 1960, a very famous Pulitzer Prize-winning novel. And To Kill a Mockingbird was written by Harper Lee, which you know, and up until 2015, it was the only novel that Lee ever published. Now, Lee passed away in 2016, was in her late 80s at the time, or she was in her late 80s in 2015 when Watchmen was published. She was in very poor health and generally considered not to be in a presence of mind suitable for deciding on whether or not she wanted this second manuscript published. The fact that she left it so late in her life would suggest that she didn't. Anyway, to cut a long and complicated story short, there were a lot of people who suggested that Lee never really wanted Watchmen to be published, and indeed that she had not even written the novel in its entirety. So to settle this part of the matter, Chewinski, Rybicki and Ether conducted stylometric tests, and if you're interested in stylometry, really seek out the work of the latter, Jan Rybicki and Matthew Ether, who have done some wonderful work in the field. But they conducted some tests to show that there's absolutely no doubt that Harper did write the novel. Now, whether or not she wanted the world to see it is an entirely different matter, but we can at least say that she, with some certainty, that she did write it. And this type of authorship attribution test is really where stylometry got its start. The first scholars to work in stylometry asked questions like, did Shakespeare really write Shakespeare, which he did, and generally looked, to attribute anonymous texts to their authors based on the evidence of style. Matt Jockers, to give one of many other examples, has an interesting study where he attempts to identify who wrote the Book of Mormon. And if you go to the departmental YouTube channel, you will find an interesting study of Catalan novels where our colleague from the Department of Spanish, Portuguese and Latin American Studies attempts to identify the author of Catalunia's most famous erotic novel. But, stylometry isn't just useful for identifying the author of contested or anonymous texts. It's also useful in looking at things like authorial influence, collaborative writing, cultural factors in authorship, basically anything that might be relevant to how something is written. And I'll show examples of these sorts of things when I talk about some examples from my own work, but basically stylometry is useful when the question you are asking might be answered, or partly answered at least, through examining how a text or set of texts have been written. So I'd like to outline now how stylometry is generally approached from a methodological perspective, and I say generally because, as noted at the beginning, there are different ways in which one go about doing a stylometric test, and that is a whole world in itself. A good starting point is the work of John Burroughs, who in the late 80s published a book which is unfortunately now out of print, but you might be able to pick up a second-hand copy here or there. I believe there may be a copy in the library, but I am not sure. But you may pick up a second-hand copy on in your local bookshop or on various book-selling websites, which I would rather not promote. But there you go. But it's called Computation into Criticism. And in the book, Burroughs uses stylometry to do an analysis of Jane Austen's novels. And Burroughs opens the book with this statement, which always stuck with me. I think it's very, very powerful. It is a truth not generally acknowledged that in most discussions of works of English fiction, we proceed as if a third, 2/5, a half of our material were not really there. Now, what does Burroughs mean by that? So what he's referring to really is what we call Zipf's law. So Zipf's law states that in most languages across a large sample of words, the frequency of any word is inversely proportional to its rank in the frequency table. And what that means is that if you take a text and create a list of words ranked by the frequency with which the words appear in the text, the top words are exponentially the most frequent words. So the first word will be twice as populous as the second word, and so on and so forth. Okay, so when you visualize the frequency of words based on their rank in a frequency table, you will always get this linear sort of downward curve. So basically, Zipf's law tells us that the most frequent words in a text make up the vast majority of the words. Okay, the top 10 words are like 70% of the words. So most texts aren't actually that diverse in terms of their lexicon. And what is also interesting about the most frequent words in any text is that they are always boring words. So what do I mean by boring words? Well, let's take this sentence here. It was a bright, cold day in April and the clocks were striking 13. So this is the first line of George Orwell's 1984, generally considered to be one of the greatest works of fiction ever written. And if you haven't read it, then that is something you should really remedy, particularly in times such as these. Now, ask yourself, what are the interesting words in this sentence? I would suggest that they are bright, cold, day, April, clocks striking, and 13. These are the interesting words. They're interesting because these are the words that give the sentence its meaning. These are the words which Orwell would have thought long and carefully about. I mean, I think it's significant that Orwell chose to describe the day on which his novel begins as bright, as cold, and in April. It is significant that he conjures in the opening sentence this side, the symbol of a clock, and that they are striking 13. And we won't get into why they're significant, but these are significant. He thought about these aspects of the sentence with great depth. And I think what's a useful way to think about interesting words or significant words, is that if you take away the boring words like the and in, the meaning of the message is still kind of present. If I just said to you, bright, cold day, April, clocks striking 13, you probably get the gist of what I was trying to say, yeah? The kind of day it is, when the day is, and what time it is. And that's because these kind of words dictate the content of a text. These content words tell you what a text is about. And if you look at the entire text in this way, you get a sort of thematic analysis. So this word cloud, now I generally hate word clouds, but I won't get into that today, shows the most frequent words in 1984. And you can see from the high frequency of words like party, thought, war, people, world, voice, newspeak, and so on. This is an inherently socio-political novel. You could tell this without even reading the novel, looking at the most frequent words. But of course, these aren't the most frequent words. Now, you often see in word clouds, people represent the words that emerge as the most frequent words, but they're not the most frequent words. They're not even close to the most frequent words. These are the most frequent content words, because whenever we do a most frequent word analysis, we are applying a list of stop words. And a stop word list will basically remove the words like it, was, a, and the. Basically all of the words that aren't significant in terms of a text content. The boring words. The words that don't really tell us anything about what the text is about. And these boring words are what we call function words. And their only real purpose is to serve some grammatical function, which is why they're boring, yeah? Basically, function words, boring words, they structure sentences. They make sentences comprehensible. But they have nothing to do really with the content of a text. And it's important that we remove them with a stop word list when doing a content analysis, because they are by far, and we know this because of Zipf's law, the most frequent words. In most languages, remember, the most frequent words in a text will always be function words. And we know by Zipf's law that the most frequent words dominate a text. Okay? So if you did a word cloud and you just saw like the and if, that's not going to tell you anything. But if you took 1,000 novels now in the English language and did a most frequent word analysis, the and if would be the top 3 most frequent words each time. That tells us nothing about the text, which is why we remove them. So Burroughs goes on to say, for most readers and most critics, it seems very common words such as these are to be taken as perfect specimens of the harmless drudge performing necessary tasks but deserving no particular attention. For the makers of concordances, they are fit only to be excluded as non-significant words, or what I call boring words. So these words here on the screen will almost, as I said, they will almost always be among the most frequent words in an English language text. They'll be far more frequent than any other word we might consider interesting or indicative of content. And this is what Burroughs meant when he said that normally when reading, we proceed as if a third, 2/5, or half, a third, 2/5, or half of our material were not really there. It's because we ignore these words when doing analysis of text using most methods. No critic has ever said, isn't it interesting how many times this author uses the word "de" or "have"? But that's precisely what stylometry seeks to do. So unlike other forms of analysis, it looks at the boring words because they are the most frequent, and it does so in an effort to form an impression of how an author writes. So function words are a good indicator of an author's style because they are the words that we tend to choose subconsciously. So this is the theory now of stylometry. So as I mentioned earlier, Orwell would have thought long and hard about setting that first day in April, about describing it as bright and cold, about the clocks and the time they struck. I mean, he may have taken years to finalise those details in his writing. I mean, I don't know how long it took him to write 1984, but we can be sure that he didn't worry about his use of the word "de" and the word "and." And this is the critical assumption that stylometry makes. Because authors don't really think about function words, they're resistant to intentional authorial manipulation, and they have nothing at all to do with the subject matter of a text. Instead, they form part of what we call an authorial fingerprint, which is the natural way in which a specific author writes. So this is where we could really go down the rabbit hole in terms of method, which I'm not going to do because, as I said, it is a whole world in itself and would simply take far more time than is available to us here. And I also think is less interesting than the application. I want to get to some results of some stylometric tests. But if you want a comprehensive review of the mathematical principles behind stylometry, then you might want to look at the paper cited here, published by Stefan Evert and a whole host of co-authors. But basically how stylometry works is it starts by tokenizing texts, which means it turns them into a bag of individual words, and then it counts up the frequency of each word and ranks them based on that frequency. So we use relative frequencies, of course, to account for the difference in length between texts, which is basically the proportional frequency of a word. Yeah, so it's calculated by taking the raw frequency of a word and then dividing it by the total number of words in the text. We then standardize the word frequencies, which means we basically normalize the frequencies such that, over the whole corpus, the mean for each word is 0, and then a document vector, which you possibly be familiar with. Again, vectors are a whole thing in themselves, but you've possibly done them in your data analytics class. You would have done them in your data analytics class, I'm sure. But we create a document vector with all of these normalized scores, and then these scores are used to calculate the distance and do our cluster analysis. Let me try and explain that a bit more intuitively. What we're basically doing here is applying statistics to determine what is known as the nearest neighbor. So we are taking texts and conducting a cluster analysis to determine how similar or dissimilar they might be based on a comparison of their most frequent words. And that is actually quite simple. Stylometry is a very simple method, which is, I think, why it's used so much in DH. It's easy to understand, and it's quite robust. It's based on simple sums, relatively simple sums, yeah. And we know that this works because it's based on the theoretical assumption that, or we believe it works, because it's based on the theoretical assumption that by counting the most frequent words in the text, we get a sense of who wrote something, not what they wrote about, who wrote it, because the most frequent words in the text are function words and thus typically resistant to signals like genre, the subject matter of a text, intentional authorial manipulation, and so on. We know that Orwell uses the word the X amount of times, and Maureen McCarran tends to use the word Y, uses the word the Y number of times. So using this method, we can tell if a text is more like Orwell or McCarran based on the number of times the word "the" is used. Because Orwell uses it this many times, McCarran uses it this many times. This is how they tend to write. So we can do a cluster analysis based on that, because we don't deviate from how we write. The way we write is how we write. Even the greatest authors, they can only write within their ability. Yeah. And we present our findings of a stylometric test using some type of clustering technique, typically a dendrogram, which you can see on a slide here, an example of a dendrogram, which shows distance as height. So basically, the further you have to travel from one cluster to another, and by distance I mean going along the lines between the clusters, the greater the similarity between the text. So you can see, this is kind of hard to do without being there in front of you and being able to run my finger along the lines and whatnot. But you can basically hear that you can see here on this dendrogram that there are two clusters. So there's what I've called cluster A, and I've put in the boxes here, cluster A and cluster B. This is my interpretation of these clusters, yeah, of this dendrogram. So you can see that there's cluster A, which comprises text 1 and 2, and cluster B comprising text 3, 4, and 5. And I have identified these two clusters as separate clusters because to get from 1 and 2 over to 3, 4, and 5, I need to follow those blue arrows all the way over to the other cluster. So cluster B is over to the right, cluster A is to the left. So 1 and 2 are like each other, 3, 4, and 5 are like each other. You can see 4 and 5 are a little closer, so 4 and 5 are a bit more like than 3 and 5. But you have to resist close reading, distant reading results. But that's possibly a different issue we may return to. But basically this is how stylometry is done. We analyze the frequency of words to create clusters that indicate stylistic similarity and dissimilarity, and then we use those findings to develop interpretations about how the text being observed, have been written, or who they've been written by. Yeah. So, I mean, one final quick summary of what's going on here. Think of it like this. We all choose words when we write. That's how writing works. And we refer to that process of choosing a style. So the words I choose, as I said, will be different to the words you choose. And so my style, as I've already said, will inevitably be different to yours. And the most frequent words are unconscious selections. So they are useful for forming fingerprints of an author's style. And they are always function words, which means they indicate style rather than subject matter or genre. And statistically, words are useful. Words are very useful for statistical analysis because they are invariants. If you write 10 texts in the same language, you will be choosing from the same pool of variables or words each time, yeah? Because there's only so many words in the English language. Okay, that might seem like a lot to us, but to a statistical analysis, there are a tiny amount of words in the English language, or any language for that matter. And I mean, for further illustration, for one last illustration, here's an example of stylometry in action, this time using two real data sets. The corpus of Henry James, who was an author, versus the corpus of Charles Dickens, who was an author. And as you might expect, there are two clear clusters. On one side, you have all the works by Dickens, and as you follow along that big long line that goes off to the left, you come around to the other works by James. Now obviously distance is still measured by height, but you can see here that I've just turned my graph horizontal, which I will do throughout. No, I won't actually do that throughout. I sometimes turn my graphs so that they're horizontal. I think it just looks nicer on the page. Okay. So, what can you actually do with all of that? So working through a few examples from my own research, what I hope to do now, and I'm conscious of the time, I maybe lingered on that a bit longer than I should have, but I hope to show you what stylometry looks like in practice. So the first example I'm going to talk about is a study of James Patterson that I did with my colleague Simon Fuller, which was published in Digital Humanities Quarterly. So in this study we looked at James Patterson, who is by a considerable stretch the world's best-selling author. And according to his publisher, Patterson has written 114 New York Times bestsellers, with his total bibliography is upwards of 150 novels. And Patterson, whose work I'm really not at all familiar with, is a master of what one might call commuter fiction. So the kind of novel that you buy in an airport when you've a long flight ahead of you. Yeah, I mean his books are by all accounts very thrilling stuff. They're quite easy to read. They're full of accessible language, short chapters, large font. Patterson he's actually a very interesting guy. He's got a background in marketing, and he has basically applied consumer research to his writing in an effort to appeal to the broadest audience possible. And he's been very successful in doing so, as we can see. Now you might be thinking, how does one person write 150 novels? Well, this has largely been accomplished through the use of collaborators. So what he finds is junior co-authors and offers them a chance to make their name under the tutelage of the world's most commercially successful author. And they get a flat fee for doing so, so they get, to write a novel with famous novelist, and they also get a few quid for doing so. And he's quite transparent about this process, to be fair to him. Basically what happens is the junior, he speaks quite openly about how it works. He says that the junior co-authors basically work from a narrative framework that he provides, and then he either does some rewriting of the drafts they give him, or he comes up with notes and sends them notes on their drafts, and they do the rewriting. So when Simon and I set out to do our stylometric analysis of Patterson, we had one central research question in mind. How much writing must one do to become the world's best-selling author? How much actual writing does James Patterson do? I mean, does Patterson do any of the writing in his co-authored novels, or is it the junior collaborator who typically does the writing, and Patterson is really just a brand at this point? That his name in a novel suggests that you're going to get a good story, but it doesn't really tell you anything about how the story is going to be written. And we basically decided that we would use stylometry to do this test, that we would see in Patterson's co-authored novels whether it was his or the co-author's stylistic fingerprint that was most dominant. Now you can see here that we immediately have a few issues in terms of, apologies for the background noise, but it will pass momentarily. But you can see here that we have a few issues in terms of how stylometry works in practice. So in testing the authorial fingerprint in any text to see who the style can be attributed to, you need to have a writing sample for all likely candidates. That's a big limitation of stylometry, because oftentimes all likely candidates, you don't have writing samples for all of the likely candidates. Now, luckily for us in this context, some of Patterson's co-authors have gone on to have solo careers, some have not. So you can see that, we were able to get a sample for some of his co-authors, which again was fortunate, because if that had not been the case, I mean, a lot of Patterson's co-authors have not gone on to have solo careers. So we're fortunate that a few have, so that we could do this test. Now, we did a lot of things in this study, but for the sake of time, there was one thing I want to draw your attention to. What we see here is a form of cluster analysis called a consensus tree. Again, time is against us. I won't get into what a consensus tree is, but I think it's quite intuitive to understand, yeah. And basically the clusters here are again represented by proximity. So texts that sit together are more similar. So you can see that there's 3 or so clusters here, 2 of which I'd like to draw your attention to. So there's the cluster on the right, which are the Patterson only novels, and this cluster, you've got the cluster on the bottom left, which are novels written by Andrew Gross. So solo novels written by Andrew Gross. And Andrew Gross is a co-author of Patterson, who will go on to write his own novels, fortunately for us. So we could test so we could form his authorial fingerprint to do this test. Now the cluster in the bottom right hand corner shows novels co-authored by Gross and Patterson. And as you can see, there is closer proximity. This cluster in the bottom right, the cluster of Gross and the co-authored Gross and Patterson novels, that cluster is closer to the Gross-only novels than it is the Patterson-only novels. Okay, not way closer, but a little closer. Okay, but there's one mistake. There is one mistake in our clusters, and that's, you can see that blue one sat in the middle of the green ones. Okay, that is a Patterson-only novel, but according to our results, it bears the authorial fingerprint of Andrew Gross. It sits in the cluster of Patterson-Gross collaborations. So our results has one mistake, okay? So why is that? And this is what stylometry does. You say, like, typically you should get what you expect, and when you don't get what you expect, you say, well, why is that? Is there something interesting going on here? So the series that Patterson wrote with Gross was called The Women's Murder Club, and it was based on a group of women in San Francisco who liked to solve murders as a hobby. And this series was important to Patterson because he was being outsold by John Grisham among female readers in the northwest of the US. So with his marketing exec cap on, Patterson announced a new series of novels that would appeal directly to the demographic for which he was only the number 2 best-selling author. And when the new Women's Murder Club series was announced, an exciting part of the announcement was that the first novel in the series would be written by James Patterson alone, which is a rare treat for his fans. It's not often that he does a solo novel. But of course, our findings suggest that Patterson did not write this novel himself, and that it is, as with the rest of the Women's Murder Club series, a collaboration with Andrew Gross, and Gross's contribution, which was the writing of the thing, was not acknowledged. Now, of course, our Patterson study raises a lot of, it's not about, gotcha moments. That's not what stylometry is. This study raises a lot of questions around the notion of authorship, and you're welcome, of course, to go read the study in DHQ, which is open access. I think in particular this study asks us what makes an author. Is it style, or is it plot? Patterson admits that the collaborator does most of the writing, but it's he who comes up with the plot. Now, style is something that wasn't really privileged until aesthetic movements like modernism emerged. And, the novel, if you go back to its origin, was all about what Patterson does. It was a leisure time activity. It was about reading good stories. It didn't matter how they were written. It was about a good story, yeah? And it wasn't until modernism and the rise of criticism and academia that we started to see this tension between literary fiction and fiction, which is still something that is very much contested today. The idea of literary quality is a very controversial thing among critical circles and literary scholars and writers and readers. So one thing that you might ask of style is, does it even have anything to do with authorship in the literary sense of the term? If the general reader cares more about plot and subject matter than they do how something is written, then what is the place of style in literature? And we use the Patterson study to sort of engage with that question, which we won't do here for the sake of time, because I'm conscious that things are getting away from me. Now, one thing about stylometry, it is something that I think can be said of cultural analytics in general. The results should always make sense to you as a critic, and I touched on this just briefly previously. If they don't, you either have a discovery or a mistake, yeah? So you should get what you expect. So in this next example, we were looking for similarities with Irish modernist writers, and we came across a few things that we didn't expect. So as you can see here, all of the authors have clustered correctly, with the exception of Beckett's novel Murphy, which clusters away from the other Beckett novels in the study, and Flann O'Brien's novel At Swim Two Birds clusters with the work of James Joyce, and not with the other Flann O'Brien or Brian O'Nolan. His pen name was Flann O'Brien, not with the other Flann O'Brien novels. Now, the Beckett anomaly is easily explained. The Beckett mistake, say, is easily explained. It has to do with that novel being a first-generation English language novel, while the others are translations. So basically Beckett is two distinct styles: Beckett, the English language writer, and Beckett, the translator, which actually might be interesting to the Beckett scholars, which I'm not. The other mistake is harder to explain, unless you want to argue that James Joyce actually wrote Flann O'Brien's At Swim Two Birds, which would, obviously be nonsense. But anyway, this study I worked on with Katarzyna Bazarnik, Matt Yetter, and Jan Rybicki, and it's a good example, I think, of how stylometry can be used to re-engage with long-standing critical debates, about returning to things that scholars have been talking about and critics have been arguing about for years, and bring a new kind of evidence or a new kind of reading. And one of the things, examinations of the stylistic affinities between Flann O'Brien and James Joyce have been around for decades. I mean, when O'Brien's At Swim Two Birds was first published, for example, it was described as having Joycean undertones and seeking to imitate Joyce. I mean, it was described as I think it was Sean O'Faolain remarked that the novel had an odour of Joyce being spilt all over it. So, I mean, this was interesting to us because our findings showed that the stylistic similarities between O'Brien's novel and Joyce's work were so strong that the computer had misclassified O'Brien's novel as something which had been written by Joyce. So to see what is going on here, we did what is called a rolling delta analysis, which is used to compare the style of one or multiple texts against one text, okay, broken into segments or windows. So I mean, what you can see here, okay, so let me explain what's going on here. What you see is on the x-axis here, the x-axis represents the novel Ulysses, written by James Joyce, broken into segments of 5,000 words. Now the coloured lines on the graph represent a particular novel. Each colour is represented in the legend in the top left corner, you know, which colour relates to which novel. And the closer each line is to the x-axis, the greater the stylistic affinity to that particular segment of the text, which is Ulysses. So this is why we call it rolling delta. It's doing a delta test, but over rolling windows of one novel, yeah? So you would expect that Joyce's novels would be closer to the x-axis throughout, yeah? Because, you know, the test novel on the x-axis is Ulysses, which is Joyce, so you'd expect the lines which represent Joyce novels to be closer throughout. But there are two instances where the style in O'Brien's At Swim Two Birds is closer to the style of Ulysses than Joyce's own style. So what's going on there is the question we asked, okay? Why are there two places in Ulysses where Flann O'Brien's style is more like Joyce than Joyce himself? Well, there are a few reasons, one of which is parody. And again, you can go read this paper. It's open access in digital studies. It's called Measuring... I put it up there. It's, yeah, measuring Joycean influences on Flann O'Brien. But as I said, parody is one of the reasons. Okay, so our rolling delta analysis demonstrates that there are significant similarities between the style of At Swim Two Birds and the Oxen of the Sun and the Eumaeus episodes in Ulysses. Now, Oxen of the Sun is a particularly parodic episode. It sort of presents this sort of panorama of historical styles of the English language, starting from like Old Anglo-Saxon chronicles and elegies, of which I know nothing about, to, you know, modern slang, kind of contemporary to the author and Joyce's Dublin. Now, At Swim Two Birds is also intensely parodical, and like Oxen of the Sun, it draws upon this really wide range of sources, you know, everything from kind of high modernist works, you know, translations of old Celtic legends. You know, there's a range of non-literary styles parodied, you know, correspondence with a horse racing pundit, this kind of thing. And what was interesting was, you can see here in this additional rolling delta of the Oxen episode on its own, you can see that as Joyce progresses through his chronological parody of the English language, the closer to O'Brien's style the episode gets. So this tells us, and I appreciate that this is complicated now, and you know, me going through this at such pace is a little complicated, but what this tells us, let me tell you what this tells us, and you can take my word for it. This tells us that O'Brien quite successfully parodies the parodies of Joyce. He mimics the type of local Irish slang that one encounters at the end of Oxen throughout the entirety of At Swim Two Birds. I mean, look, there's loads that can be said here, and I'm really conscious of time now. But basically, what you see here is that stylometry, when applied to a corpus, isn't always just telling us who wrote something. It is often telling us something far more nuanced about the relationship between texts. It is the role, you know, of the critic then to interpret the significance of that relationship. Now, look, there may be an entirely different reason other than parody for the proximity between these texts. And our hope is that our interpretation of these findings will prompt further responses and different conclusions and other interpretations from other critics and scholars. I mean, one of the great dangers in any computational method is forgetting that their findings are only as reliable as their interpretation. And maybe we're wrong about our interpretation of this being parity. Now, I mean, the final study I wanted to talk about was a collaboration between myself and a colleague, Sean Weidman, which basically looked at the ongoing argument around gender markers in stylometry. So in this instance, we conducted a delta test, but we also used a technique called Craig's Zeta. So Zeta is designed to measure difference between authors, okay? So it's designed to measure difference, not similarity. And it's a relatively simple method. So, I mean, in terms of style, it's useful to think of Zeta as the inverse of delta, even though it's not really what it is, but it's useful to think of it that way. In that, rather than looking for similarity based on the most frequent words, this time you're looking for those words that are distinct to authors. So basically, you're taking all the stuff that you ignore in delta and using it to see where texts or authors are inherently different based on word choice. So the way it works is it takes, I mean, briefly again, it takes two sets of texts. So, you know, the two sets of texts being whatever comparison you want to make. It divides all of the texts into sections of equal length, and then it compares how often each word in all texts appears in each section. So it's largely concerned with the consistency with which an author might use a particular word in a text. So, I mean, basically it's determining the ratio at which a word appears in sections written by one author with the ratios of the other author or set of authors, and then uses that measurement to determine if a word is more distinct to one author over another, and then tells you which words are distinct to a particular author or set of authors. So I appreciate that might be confusing in a short overview, okay? But basically, think of it like this. If you take two corpora, say corpus A and corpus B, and corpus A and corpus B can be made up of whatever you want, anything at all. There has to be two of them though, because it's a comparative method, yeah? So it will tell you the words that tend to appear in corpus A that don't appear in corpus B, and vice versa. So say corpus A is text by me, James O'Sullivan, and corpus B is text by Maureen McCarran. The results will tell you that James O'Sullivan writes about things like video games and electronic literature, and Maureen McCarran writes about medieval things like Bede and I don't know, other medieval things. I don't know any medieval things. Okay, so David Hoover, who has loads of interesting macros for doing stylometry stuff in Excel, by the way. So if you Google David Hoover stylometry spreadsheets, you'll probably find his site. And but he basically started a bit of an ongoing debate back in 2010 when he used Zeta to conduct a test of 13 male and 13 female poets. Okay? And what you see here are the lists of the distinctive words he generated, that Zeta generated. So the words on the left are those distinctive to the female poets, and the words on the right are distinctive to the males. And as you can see, in both instances, you find words which might be considered to reinforce gender stereotypes. So the women talk about domestic things like mothers and skin and furniture, you know, things like love and mirrors, whereas the men talk about, you know, strength, lust, and beer. Beer is there. Of course beer is there, you know, men talk about beer, yeah? And then David took those results and he did an interesting thing with Delta. What he did was he ran a stylometric test, but using those distinct words as his word list in place of the normal most frequent word list that you would generate. And so basically he wanted to see if giving Delta a list of words that are distinctively male and distinctively female, could you separate authors based on a supposed style of gender? And he was successful in that most of the authors clustered together based on these words, whether they were male or female. Okay, so the male authors clustered and the female authors clustered based on these stereotypical words. Now the method is sound. The method works. Okay, Hoover's findings have been validated. They're accurate. But in practice, there are critical issues. And myself and Sean Weidman, my colleague who I wrote this current paper with, the paper I'm referencing now, we drew out some of these issues and responded to Hoover and some other papers on this topic, because there's a few. It's kind of an ongoing debate. And the closer the points are on these plots, the more similar the word choice, okay? So densely packed clusters of points basically represent male or female authors using similar words. You know, the closer the words, the less distinct the range of vocabulary, if that makes sense, yeah? So, and what you can see here is that in the Victorian and contemporary periods, there really is a lot of crossover between the men and women. I mean, there is some difference, and we'll talk about that in a bit, you know, because Zeta will always find difference because that's what it's designed to do. But what you should be really looking for, I would argue, is the amount of difference. And what you can see here is that there really isn't much in the Victorian and contemporary cases. And the exception, of course, then is the modernist era, wherein something interesting is going on with both the women and the men. Now, so the men are very similar to each other. I mean, look how condensed they are. So the modernist one, if you can't see it, is the middle one, yeah? So it's chronological. So look how condensed they are. So they're basically all using the same distinct words. The modernist men drew from the same vocabulary pool, basically. And the women are quite different from the men, okay? But not only this, the women are quite different from each other, okay? You can see how scattered they are. Now we interpreted this, and again, you might disagree with our interpretation. We interpreted this as evidence that the modernist era, and when I say modernist in this context, I mean high modernism. So I'm talking about literature that was written from 1910 to 1940 or so. And we interpreted this as evidence that the modernist era really belonged to literary feminism, that this great era of, you know, literary experimentation was in fact a period in which female authors were the most radical. Now, of course, again, I mean, we're two men making this interpretation, doing this study, which, again, I appreciate is problematic for a whole range of reasons we don't have time to get into. You know, and there's lots more going on here that I want to linger with because I'm approaching the hour mark and Maureen is going to kill me. But basically, there's one more thing I want to draw attention to, and that's a critical issue with Hoover's approach, and indeed an issue that myself and Sean, by doing this study in the first place, have further contributed to and are also guilty of. And that is that stylometric techniques like Zeta are probably not at all appropriate for studying something like this. So stylometry, like many computer-assisted methods, omits so much context. You know, women may well be writing about children and mirrors, but in what respect? You know, in what context? Perhaps the women writing about children and mirrors, about domestic things, are problematizing these things, you know. And yes, I agree that means they're writing about them, but hardly in the way that stereotypes or distant reading would suggest. I mean, Zeta will always, every single time, find difference between your data sets, because unless you build two data sets out of the same texts, there will be difference, because no two texts are the same. Goes back to that old adage, yeah? I mean, I could compare one thing I wrote with another thing I wrote and it would find difference. And so the very proposition, I think, of comparing men to women is dangerous, because the question, do men and women write differently, is itself based on an assumption of difference. I mean, why are you constructing two data sets based on gender? That's the critical assumption you're making when you do a study like this. And this is an important critical question worth answering, because while these results do point to stereotypical vocabulary, you know, without the context which comes from close reading, and you can't close read distant results, you know, can we really make the bold claims about the language of gender that people are making out of these kinds of studies? And I don't think we can. Look, I wanted to conclude with some other practicalities that one needs to consider when doing stylometry, but I'm about to reach the hour mark, and I am conscious of everyone's time, and I'd like to have a little bit of discussion. But look, basically, you know, I appreciate I've gone through an awful lot there so I appreciate that was a bit of a whistle-stop tour, yeah. I mean, one could spend years working on stylometry, so I do understand that there are probably elements of that which was confusing. You know, you just can't do it properly in an hour even, it seems. But what I hope I've showed is what stylometry is. I hope I've shown that at least. I hope I've given a sense of how it works. and most importantly, how it can be applied, how it should be applied, what some of the practical and critical considerations, what kind of consideration one needs to make when doing this kind of work. Based on my own experiences, some of the limitations, some of the drawbacks, some of the things that you can do with stylometry other than just simple, authorship attribution. So I will leave it there, and looking forward to some further discussion. Thank you.